The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the barren training field of Zhursh 9. The air was thick with dust, swirls of red particles rising from the cracked earth. The distant mountains loomed like silent sentinels, watching over the small military academy nestled in the valley. The academy, a blend of harsh concrete and steel, was surrounded by nothing but emptiness. No trees, no life, only the endless stretch of alien terrain. Daniel Hayes stood at the edge of the field, watching with a frown as cadets lined up for the live fire drills. The hum of distant machinery mixed with the soft hiss of the atmosphere's filtered air. Daniel was human, an anomaly on a planet full of alien cadets. He'd been brought here not for his strength or agility, but for his ability to survive. As a soldier in the Earth Corps, he had faced impossible odds and fought battles no one should have survived. But this wasn't like any war he'd fought in. The cadets were young, impressionable, and the weapons they trained with were more than just tools. They were instruments of culture, of tradition. Weapons, even when their targets were just as young. Today, Daniel's assignment was simple: watch over the cub. The Torathi cub, Soren. He could still feel the weight of the assignment when the commander first placed the responsibility on him. The cub was an apex predator, bred for combat. Young, sure, but already stronger than most full-grown creatures from his world. It was conditioned to fight, to kill, to follow orders without hesitation, and that's what it had been doing ever since its arrival on Zhursh 9. But something was off. From the moment Daniel had laid eyes on Soren, the cub had done everything to avoid his gaze. It was strange. Its wide, yellow eyes would never meet his, not once. Instead, the cub would curl into itself, its powerful limbs tense with the weight of its own fear. It was almost like it had learned to hide its emotions, to be invisible. The cub's trainer, Commander Jurel, stood across the field, barking commands. His voice, deep and guttural, was like the crack of thunder. Soren was positioned at the far end of the training ground, next to a pile of obstacles meant to test its agility and speed. "Release the asset," Jurel ordered, his voice ringing across the field. The cadets around Daniel shifted, their gazes intense as they observed, but Daniel's focus was on the cub. At the command, Soren hesitated for just a moment before sprinting forward, its muscular frame cutting through the air with an unnerving grace. It moved like lightning, dodging obstacles and leaping over barriers with the precision of a trained soldier. Daniel couldn't help but watch in awe, even though he knew it wasn't a display of raw talent, it was conditioning. Soren reached the end of the course, pausing as if waiting for something. The tension in the cub's body was palpable. It wasn't out of fear, not entirely. No, Daniel could see it now. It was hesitation, a moment of uncertainty. The cub wasn't used to making its own decisions. It was trained to react, to obey. But the hesitation was brief. Soren moved again, this time charging at one of the cadets positioned near a target dummy. The cadet stood perfectly still, waiting. The cub reached the dummy in an instant and with a swift swipe of its claw, shredded it in seconds. The cadet nodded in approval, stepping aside for the next round. The cub never made eye contact, never once looked at the person it was supposed to protect or perhaps even care about. It only followed orders, and that, Daniel realized, was the problem. Soren wasn't acting like a creature born to fight. It was acting like a creature born to be controlled. "Not enough aggression," Jurel muttered under his breath, his sharp eyes narrowing in disapproval. Again. The cadets shifted, eager to see more, but Daniel felt something cold in his chest. The way Soren's movements had faltered when it first hesitated, it wasn't the same as the other creatures trained here. It wasn't just following orders. It was thinking. That could be dangerous. Daniel turned, stepping away from the training field. The last thing he wanted was to draw attention to himself, but something about Soren had changed in the past few days. It wasn't just the broken limbs or the hollow look in its eyes. There was something deeper, a fear that seemed to go beyond the immediate environment. The cub was not afraid of its trainers or its task. It was afraid of something much more profound. He glanced over at his quarters, simple, functional, like everything on Zhursh 9. But behind the cold metal walls, Daniel had a sinking feeling that he was about to witness something he couldn't ignore. Later that night, after the lights dimmed and the cadets returned to their barracks, Daniel sat on the edge of his cot, nursing his bruised knee. The pain was dull but persistent, a reminder of just how much he'd pushed himself the past few weeks. He pressed the gel pack against the bruise, the cooling sensation helping to ease the ache. Across from him, Soren lay curled in the corner of the room, not looking at him, but still so close. The cub's breathing was shallow, its tail twitching now and then, as if it were trapped in a dream it couldn't escape. The faint sounds of other cadets murmured through the walls. A conversation here, a laugh there, but it all felt so distant, out of place. Daniel's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise, two sharp thuds echoing from the corridor just outside the door. His heart skipped a beat. He rose from his cot, moving toward the door, but stopped himself before he opened it. Soren's eyes flickered in his direction, but it didn't move. Another muffled thud, then silence. "Stay here," Daniel whispered. His voice was barely audible, but it didn't matter. The cub wouldn't move, not unless something pushed it. Daniel opened the door cautiously, his eyes scanning the hallway. It was empty, save for the dim lights flickering overhead. But something wasn't right. Before he could step fully outside, the unmistakable sound of scuttling footsteps echoed down the corridor. Fast, urgent. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the noise stopped. Daniel stepped forward, the hairs on the back of his neck rising. The air felt thicker now, like something was moving just outside his vision. He was about to turn back when he heard it. A low growl, not from the cub, but from behind him. Soren had moved, quietly, swiftly, pressing its back against the door, its yellow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. For a moment they just stared at each other. There was something in those eyes, something that spoke of fear, of trust, of a connection Daniel hadn't yet fully understood. Before he could process it, the door slammed open, a cadet rushing in, breathless. "Daniel, you need to come now." It was Jural's voice, urgent and sharp, but Daniel's gaze remained locked on the cub. Something was wrong. The silence stretched between Daniel and Soren like a tightrope, delicate and frail. The cub's growl lingered in the air, its eyes flickering between the cadet in the doorway and Daniel, who stood motionless. The cub's muscles were coiled, ready to spring at a moment's notice, but it made no move. Its gaze, once fearful, now seemed to convey something else, something Daniel couldn't quite place. "Daniel," the cadet repeated, his voice more urgent this time, but still oblivious to the subtle shift in the room. "Commander Jural needs you, now." Reluctantly, Daniel turned toward the cadet, his eyes briefly meeting Soren before he stepped into the hallway. The cub didn't follow. Outside, the metallic walls of the academy felt suffocating, pressing in on Daniel as the cadet led him quickly through the sterile corridors. The sound of their boots echoed down the hall, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the cub's eyes were still on him, even as he moved farther away. They reached Jural's office, a cold, utilitarian space with dim lighting and sharp corners. The commander was waiting inside, arms crossed, his gaze hard. "Hayes," Jural began without preamble, his voice low and commanding, "I need you to do something. We're running a new drill tomorrow, and I want you to bring the cub along. We need it to learn to fight back, not just dodge and run." Daniel's stomach tightened at the request. He had seen what the cub was capable of, its agility, its intelligence. But that was the problem. It wasn't built for mindless aggression. It was a broken thing, a creature that had been turned into a weapon, and Daniel couldn't ignore the pain in its eyes every time it failed to follow orders. "I'm not sure it's ready," Daniel said quietly, his voice careful, almost too calm. Jural's eyes narrowed. "It's just a cub, Hayes. It's not your responsibility to coddle it. We don't have time for pity here. If it doesn't learn to follow through with its instincts, it will be a liability." Daniel clenched his fists, fighting the urge to lash out. He had seen enough of this kind of thinking in his time with the Earth Corps. Soldiers treated like machines, ordered to kill without question. It never ended well. "Fine," Daniel muttered, "but I'll need time to prepare it. This won't be like the others." Jural's expression softened just for a moment. "Do what you must. We'll see if you've got what it takes to turn it around." As Daniel turned to leave, the weight of the decision pressed down on him. He knew what was coming next. The drill, the violence, the expectations. But he also knew that if he didn't do this right, the cub, Soren, would be lost to the very system it had been born into. The next few days were a blur of drills, tests, and training exercises, all under Jural's unyielding supervision. Daniel spent every waking moment with Soren, trying to break through the wall the cub had built around itself. Each time he approached, Soren would flinch, its ears flattening against its skull. The cub was afraid, not just of the training, but of him. Of the trust it had started to form, only to have it shattered again by the cruel hands of its captors. But there were small victories, too. Every time Daniel sat down next to it and offered a small piece of protein ration, Soren would hesitate, then edge closer ever so slowly. The first time it took the food from his hand, Daniel felt a surge of triumph. It was a small gesture, but to him it meant more than the drill ever could. The bond between them, however fragile, began to grow stronger. Daniel had become more than just the cub's caretaker. He was its protector. He wasn't sure how it had happened, how over the course of a few days he had gone from being just another trainer to something far more personal to the creature. Soren didn't speak, of course, but Daniel could see it now. The way its eyes softened when it looked at him, how its posture changed when it sensed his presence nearby. It wasn't the same as the first day, when it had been nothing more than an obedient machine. Now it seemed to recognize him, even trust him, in a way it couldn't trust anyone else. That evening after the last of the drills, Daniel sat beside the cub, his back against the cold, metal wall of their quarters. Soren had settled beside him, its massive frame curled up against his legs, its tail twitching occasionally. The soft hum of the base's machinery filled the silence, and for a moment Daniel allowed himself to just breathe. The tension of the day seemed to melt away, replaced by the warmth of the cub's presence. "You're not broken, you know," Daniel said softly, his fingers running gently through Soren's fur. The cub stiffened just for a moment, but then it exhaled softly, its breathing deepening as it settled closer. "I don't know what happened to you," Daniel continued, "but I'm here, and I won't make you do anything you're not ready for." Soren didn't respond, but its eyes fluttered closed, its body relaxing against him. Daniel couldn't help but feel the weight of the creature's trust in that small moment. It was fragile, this connection, fragile and uncertain, but it was enough. The next morning, however, Daniel's fragile peace was shattered. He woke to the sound of shouting outside the quarters, urgent voices, commands being barked. The door to his room slid open with a sharp hiss, and in stepped a pair of armed cadets. "Hayes," one of them said, his voice tinged with irritation. "Commander Jurel wants you now, no excuses." Daniel glanced down at Soren, whose eyes snapped open at the sound of the disturbance. The cub's body tensed, but it didn't move. It was waiting for him, its gaze fixed on his. "I'll be there in a minute," Daniel said, standing and giving the cub one last, reassuring look before following the cadets down the hallway. Jurel was waiting for him in the training hall. The room was filled with the heavy scent of sweat and metal, the harsh lights casting long shadows across the floor. The cadets, already in formation, were silent as Jurel turned toward them. "This is it," Jurel said, his voice booming in the quiet room. "The final test. Hayes, bring the cub." Daniel's heart sank. He had known this moment would come, but he hadn't been ready for it. Soren, obedient as always, padded into the room beside him. But as the cub stepped into the center of the training floor, Daniel noticed something new, something that wasn't there before. The hesitation was gone. Soren's eyes met Jurel, then flicked to Daniel. And for the briefest of moments, Daniel saw a flash of defiance in those yellow eyes. It wasn't afraid anymore. The tension in the training hall was palpable. The silence that followed Jurel's command seemed to stretch on forever. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears as he watched Soren, his cub, stand motionless at the center of the room, defiant and silent. It wasn't the fear that had paralyzed it before, nor the obedience drilled into its bones. This was different. Soren wasn't just refusing to attack, it was resisting, something it had never done before. Jurel's eyes narrowed as he took a step forward, his voice a low growl. "Attack, cub, this is your purpose, you will obey." But Soren only blinked, its gaze flicking briefly toward Daniel before returning to Jurel. The hesitation was gone, but what replaced it wasn't the fierce aggression Jurel had come to expect. It was quiet rebellion. "Jurel," Daniel's voice broke the silence, quieter than he'd intended, but enough to grab the commander's attention. "This isn't how it's supposed to work. The cub, it's been through too much. It doesn't know how to be a killer not like this. We need to." "Enough," Jurel snapped, his sharp gaze cutting through Daniel's words like a blade. "You don't get to decide what it needs, I do, and it will follow orders now." With a flick of his wrist, Jurel activated the training simulation, a series of dummies designed to provoke combat instincts. They rose from the floor, robotic, lifelike in their appearance, designed to force the cub into action. They moved toward Soren with calculated precision, closing the distance quickly. Daniel's stomach dropped. He could feel the weight of the situation shift. He wasn't just standing in a training hall now. He was standing on the edge of something much darker, a precipice he hadn't realized he was on until now. This wasn't just about Soren's obedience anymore. This was about control, about breaking something that was already broken. "Attack!" Jurel barked again, this time with a venomous edge. The cub's body stiffened at the command. Its muscles tensed, but it didn't move. The dummies closed in, the whir of their mechanical joints filling the air. The first one reached Soren, and it struck, quick, efficient, a programmed punch aimed directly at the cub's chest. Soren didn't flinch. It didn't retaliate. It simply stood there, watching. Another dummy lunged, swinging a bat-like arm. The force was enough to knock a weaker creature off its feet, but not Soren. It stepped back at the last second, its movements fluid and calculated, dodging the attack with minimal effort. It was evasive, defensive, but it wasn't fighting, not the way Jurel wanted. "Move!" Jurel's voice was a jagged bark, anger flaring behind his words. He gestured sharply at one of the cadets, signaling them to activate the stun weapons. The cadet obeyed immediately, pressing a button on a control pad. The room crackled with energy as the stun spears activated, their electric arcs humming dangerously. The dummies now carried real weapons, their strikes capable of disabling Soren with just a single hit. "Do it," Jurel demanded again, his eyes burning with frustration. But Daniel could see the change in the cub. Soren was no longer following orders like a machine. It was thinking. It was choosing. The next dummy moved in, swinging the spear at Soren with a speed that could have incapacitated any other creature. But Soren was ready. At the last second, it ducked low and launched itself forward, claws outstretched, slashing across the dummy's arm and sending it crashing to the floor. The others hesitated, confused by the sudden turn of events. Daniel's heart stopped. For a brief moment he saw it, the flash of intelligence in Soren's eyes. It wasn't the mindless aggression of a creature trained to kill. It was the survival instinct of a young creature pushed beyond its limits. It wasn't just surviving, it was fighting back. But it wasn't enough. The next wave of dummies moved in, faster this time, their movements more precise. One of them swung a baton with ruthless speed, striking Soren's flank with a sickening crack. The cub stumbled, a sharp cry escaping its throat. Its legs gave out beneath it, but it didn't fall. Instead, it regained its balance, but the damage was done. Daniel's chest tightened. The cub was hurt. It was trembling, not just from the physical blow, but from something deeper, fear. Fear that it might not be able to survive this. Fear that it wasn't enough. Jurel stepped forward, his expression unreadable. He surveyed the cub, the cadets, and then, finally, Daniel. "See, it's weak, and it's your fault, Hayes. You've coddled it. You've let it think it's special. But in the end, it's just like the rest of them. If it can't fight back, it's useless." Daniel's fists clenched at his sides. Every word out of Jurel's mouth felt like a punch to the gut, each one driving a wedge between what he knew was right and what the system demanded. But he couldn't look away from the cub. He couldn't ignore the fact that Soren had fought back, even if it hadn't done so perfectly, even if it had been broken. The pain of that blow wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The cub had been pushed to the edge, but it still hadn't given up. "Enough," Daniel said, his voice shaking with the weight of the words. "You want it to fight, but you're not giving it the chance. You're breaking it." Jurel's expression hardened. "You failed, Hayes. It's not about compassion, it's about results. The cub either learns to fight or it dies." "Then let it die," Daniel spat, the words bitter in his mouth. He met Jurel's gaze with the full force of his resolve. "But not at your hands." The tension between them simmered, thick and charged. The room was silent except for the quiet hum of the training dummies as they powered down, their mission complete. Jurel stared at Daniel for a long moment, his eyes cold and unyielding. Then, with a curt nod, he turned and left the room without another word. Daniel stayed, his gaze never leaving Soren. The cub was still on the floor, its body trembling but its eyes focused on him. It wasn't the same creature it had been when they first met. The fight, the pain, it was shaping it. And Daniel had made a choice. He wasn't going to be part of the system that destroyed what was left of Soren's soul. He stepped forward, kneeling beside the cub. "You're not broken," he whispered, brushing his fingers lightly against the cub's fur. "You're not a weapon, you don't have to be." Soren didn't respond, but it didn't pull away either. Instead, it pressed closer, its head resting against Daniel's leg as if seeking comfort. For the first time, Daniel realized what he had to do. He wasn't here to train the cub to fight. He was here to show it that it didn't have to fight anymore. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as the officer stepped forward, the heavy boots echoing against the cold floor. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. The officer didn't wait for an invitation to enter. The door slid shut behind him with a soft hiss, locking them in. He was tall, angular, and dressed in the standard military uniform of the Torathi High Command, but his face was unfamiliar, pale blue skin, sharp features, his eyes cold and calculating. A rank insignia gleamed on his chest, a symbol Daniel didn't recognize, but the officer's presence alone made his skin crawl. Cadet Hayes, the officer's voice was smooth, controlled. Commander Jural has spoken highly of your unique approach to the cub, but we have a problem. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. The last thing he wanted was to draw more attention to his growing attachment to Soren, but it seemed inevitable now. I'm just doing my job, Daniel replied, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. I'm not here to play games with the cub's conditioning. The officer smiled, though the gesture didn't reach his eyes. Oh, I'm well aware of your methods, but that's not why I'm here. Daniel's instincts screamed at him to move, to get Soren out of there, but he kept his focus on the officer. He wouldn't show fear, not now. Do you know what's happening on Jersh 9, Hayes? The officer continued, taking a step closer. The military been watching not just you but the entire program, the cub, and you are becoming a problem. Daniel clenched his jaw. What do you mean by problem? The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at Soren, who had remained lying at Daniel's feet, looking up with its usual wide-eyed gaze. The cub's posture was calm, almost passive, but Daniel could see the tension in its muscles, every inch of its body still on alert. I mean, the officer said, his voice low, you've been doing something dangerous, something we didn't account for when we brought you here. You've been showing the cub compassion, teaching it trust. But trust doesn't belong here, Hayes, not in the military, not in this program. Daniel's blood ran cold. The words felt like a punch to the gut, even though he'd known, deep down, that this was where it was heading. He'd been hopping for some kind of breakthrough, something that would change the way the Torathi viewed Soren. But instead, he was hearing confirmation of his worst fear. They're going to take it from me, aren't they? Daniel asked, his voice thick with anger and a deep sense of dread. The officer's lips curled into a smirk. I'm afraid so. The higher-ups don't care about the cub's psychological welfare. They don't care about your feelings either. The program, about results, nothing more. For a moment, the room seemed to close in on Daniel, the walls pressing against his chest. The cub's presence, its quiet form resting against him, felt like the last piece of something fragile, a connection that was slowly slipping away. You don't understand, Daniel said, his voice hoarse with emotion. This cub, it's not a weapon, it's not some tool for you to use. It's a creature, a living thing. It has feelings. It has a soul. I'm not going to let you just tear that apart. The officer's eyes darkened, and for a split second, the facade of control slipped. There was something in his gaze that told Daniel this was no longer a simple conversation. It was a threat. You've made this personal, Hayes, the officer said coldly. And you're crossing a line. If you continue down this path, we will have no choice but to remove the cub from your care, permanently. The words hit Daniel like a slap to the face. He knew they weren't just empty threats. The Torathi military had their ways, their rules, and if they wanted Soren gone, they could make it happen. There was no one here to stop them. I'm not letting you take it, Daniel said, the fire of defiance burning in his chest. He stepped forward, blocking the officer's path. You're not going to break it, not while I'm here. The officer chuckled darkly, taking a step back. You think you have the power to stop this? You're just a cadet, a human cadet. You've been playing with fire, Hayes, and now you're going to burn. Daniel's pulse raced, but he didn't back down. He couldn't. If he did, if he allowed Soren to be taken again, everything he'd worked for, the bond they'd shared, would be shattered. For a moment it felt as if the whole room was spinning, the walls closing in. His chest tightened. But through the haze of anger and fear, a thought crystallized in his mind. If they wanted Soren gone, he would need to fight. But this time it wouldn't be through brute force or aggression. He had something they didn't, a connection that was real, something beyond military protocol. I'm not alone in this, Daniel said slowly, his gaze steady. I won't be. The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by Daniel's defiance. We'll see about that. You have one last chance, Hayes. Step aside. Let us take control of the cub, or things will get much worse for you. Daniel took a deep breath, steeling himself. I'm not stepping aside. With that, the officer gave a sharp nod, and Daniel knew in that moment things were about to escalate. He wasn't sure what the officer meant by worse, but he could feel the weight of the threat hanging in the air. The officer turned on his heel, stepping toward the door. "This isn't over, Hayes. You'll regret this." The door slid open, and the officer exited the room, leaving Daniel standing with Soren, both of them now caught in the crossfire. For a moment, Daniel just stood there, his mind racing. He knew the time had come to act, to take a stand not just for himself, but for the cub. He couldn't let them destroy what they had built. He wouldn't. The heavy silence that followed the officer's departure lingered in the room like a storm cloud, thick and oppressive. Daniel stood frozen for a moment, his hand still resting on the cub's side, the warmth of Soren's body seeping into his skin. The cub had tensed slightly when the officer left, as if expecting something terrible to happen next, but now it had relaxed again, its massive head gently leaning against Daniel's leg. The quiet was both a comfort and a curse. Soren's breathing was slow and steady, its fur bristling only when Daniel moved. Daniel tried to steady his own breath, the shock of what he had just heard still echoing in his chest. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was clear: he couldn't back down. The stakes had just been raised. Daniel's hand trembled as he withdrew it from the cub's side. It wasn't from fear. No, he'd long since learned to hide that. It was the weight of responsibility. If the military wanted Soren, they wouldn't stop until they had it. And worse, they didn't care how they got it. They didn't care if Soren was torn apart in the process. Daniel stepped away from the cub, moving slowly, the metal floor humming beneath his boots. He paced the small room, thinking, calculating. If he was going to protect Soren, he needed more than just determination. He needed a plan. He needed to be smarter than the military, smarter than Jural, smarter than the officer who had just threatened him. The door slid open behind him, and he turned to see one of the cadets, his face pale, standing in the threshold. It was Zethar, a Torathi cadet with dark green skin and sharp features that, though younger than most of the others, seemed to hold an uncanny level of understanding. "Cadet Hayes," Zethar said, his voice low but urgent. "You need to listen to me. I know what's happening. They're not just taking the cub, they're targeting you too, and they won't stop until they've made an example of both of you." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" Zethar hesitated, his dark eyes flicking to Soren before locking onto Daniel. "You're becoming a threat, Hayes, you and the cub, and not just because of what you've done here. There are others who are watching, others who are afraid of what you're doing, the Torathi leadership. They see what's happening. They see that you've made a bond with it, a real one, and that's dangerous, not just for the cub, for you." Daniel's stomach twisted as he processed Zethar's words. The threat was more than he'd realized. It wasn't just the military. The very structure of the Torathi society was starting to shift, and not in their favor. Zethar took a step forward, lowering his voice even further. "You need to leave, Hayes. Now, get off Zersh 9 before they escalate. If you stay, they'll use everything they have to break you, and they'll use the cub to do it." Daniel felt a chill settle over him, but his resolve only grew stronger. He couldn't leave, not now, not when Soren had come this far. "I'm not running," Daniel replied, his voice low but unwavering. "If I run now, I lose everything, and I won't let that happen." The cadet's eyes narrowed in silent frustration. "You don't understand. It's not just you, it's what you're becoming. The longer you stay, the worse it gets. You're drawing attention from all sides. They'll use everything in their power to destroy you. The cub doesn't stand a chance." Daniel met Zethar's gaze, feeling the weight of his words, but still he couldn't relent. "I'll protect it, no matter what." Zethar stepped back, his expression unreadable. He seemed to want to say something more, but instead he gave a sharp nod and turned, walking out without another word. Daniel stood alone again in the dimly lit room, the weight of Zethar's warning pressing on him. His mind raced, but he couldn't afford to hesitate. The time to act was now. The next morning, Daniel found himself standing outside the training facility, Soren by his side, both of them cloaked in the early morning mist. The compound behind them was still, the air thick with the promise of a storm, an unsettling, heavy feeling that hung in the air. There was a subtle shift in the way the cadets moved, their eyes lingering on him and Soren as they passed by, their expressions uncertain, as if they too felt the tension that had begun to ripple through the base. Daniel's hand rested on Soren's back, feeling the subtle tremor of the cub's muscles beneath his fingers. They hadn't spoken, but he could sense the weight in the air, both of them caught in a moment that could change everything. "We need to go," Daniel murmured to the cub, though he wasn't sure if it could understand. But as if on cue, Soren's yellow eyes locked with his, and the cub gave a low, almost imperceptible growl. A sound that wasn't quite a warning but more like a question, an understanding. Daniel reached down, scratching behind Soren's ears, trying to offer some comfort, though his own heart felt heavy with the knowledge that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. He heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching, and he turned sharply to see several cadets rounding the corner. They weren't looking at him with the same casual indifference they once had. No, this time their gazes were heavy, laden with something else. Fear, disgust, it didn't matter. Daniel knew what this was. He and Soren were no longer just outcasts. They were targets. As the group drew closer, one of them, a Torathy named Vale, stepped forward, his expression tense but serious. "You're not supposed to be here, Hayes," Vale said quietly, his voice low and filled with warning. "They've already made their decision. You've gone too far, you've defied orders. If you don't leave now, they'll make sure you regret it." Daniel's eyes flicked to Soren, whose body had tensed the moment Vale spoke, a low growl rumbling deep in its chest. The cub was scared. It was terrified, but Daniel wouldn't leave, not now. "You're wrong," Daniel said, stepping forward, his voice clear and steady. "I'm not going anywhere." Vale's eyes hardened. "Then you're a fool." He turned, signaling to the other cadets, who began to surround Daniel and Soren. "It's over." For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, the quiet tension before the storm. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced from cadet to cadet, nodding the unease in their movements. They weren't sure either. But Vale's voice rang out again, louder this time as he stepped closer. "You're outnumbered. Soren is a weapon. You are nothing but a cadet." Daniel's fingers tightened on the cub's fur, and he felt a surge of defiance flood through him. The officer, the cadets, the entire military might be watching him, but they didn't understand. They didn't understand what Soren was capable of. The silence that followed was deafening. Every cadet, every officer, every bystander stood frozen as Soren's massive form loomed over Vale, its claws extended, just inches from his chest. The tension was palpable, thick with the electric hum of unspoken threats and fear. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Soren's posture was rigid, its muscles trembling, but it hadn't made the first move. It was waiting, waiting for something, waiting for him. Vale's eyes widened slightly, his body stiffening under the weight of the cub's presence. He didn't dare move. The cub's yellow eyes gleamed with an intensity Daniel had never seen before, and for the first time, Soren looked more than just a frightened creature. It looked powerful, in control. Daniel stepped forward, his voice low but steady. "Put the weapons down," he said to the cadets, his gaze never leaving Vale's. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, the judgment, the fear, but he didn't care. His focus was on the cub, on keeping the fragile thread of trust they had built intact. Vale opened his mouth to speak, but he hesitated. The words seemed to die in his throat, as if the situation was more than he was prepared to handle. Behind him, the other cadets shifted nervously, their fingers twitching around their weapons, but none of them made a move to draw them. Soren's claws hovered over Vale's chest, its sharp tips grazing the surface of his armor but not piercing it. The cub's eyes were locked on Daniel, as if waiting for him to give the signal, to say the word. But Daniel wasn't sure what to do. "I'm not your enemy," Daniel said, his voice almost a whisper, but it carried in the silence. He spoke to Vale, to the cadets, to anyone who would listen. "You're not here to fight me. You're here to follow orders, but I'm not going to let you use Soren to kill for you." For a long moment, Vale just stared at him, the fear in his eyes slowly being replaced by something else, something darker. But he didn't speak. "Step back," Daniel repeated, his tone more insistent now. "This ends here." Vale's hand slowly moved to his side, hovering near his weapon, but then he stopped. It wasn't just fear that stopped him, it was something else. Doubt. The reality of what they were doing, of what they had been trained to believe, was starting to crack. They weren't just fighting for control over a weapon. They were fighting for something much more complex, and something Daniel had learned the hard way to never underestimate: trust. The tension in the room held for a long time until finally, Vale let out a long breath and nodded, stepping back with the other cadets following his lead. The atmosphere was still charged, but it was no longer as hostile. The cadets hadn't disarmed, but they hadn't attacked either. They were waiting, watching. Soren's claws slowly retracted, its body relaxing just slightly. Its yellow eyes never left Daniel, but the tension in its form eased. It hadn't reacted to Vale's aggression the way it was supposed to. It hadn't attacked. Instead, it had stood still, waiting for Daniel to act. The cub hadn't seen an enemy in the cadets, it had seen only fear, and it had trusted Daniel not to push it into violence. "You're not going to make it out of here alive, Hayes," Vale said, his voice sharp, but lacking the venom it had held earlier. "You and the cub, you're both too much of a risk now. You don't belong here. If you stay, you'll bring this place down." Daniel met Vale's gaze, his face hardening. He wasn't going anywhere. "Then I'll take that chance, but I won't leave Soren behind." Vale stared at him for a moment longer, his face unreadable before he turned and walked away, his cadets following suit. Daniel stayed where he was, his heart pounding in his chest. The danger wasn't over. If anything, it had just escalated. But Soren was still with him, and as long as they had each other, they had a chance. Later that night, Daniel sat on the edge of his cot, Soren lying beside him. The cub's breathing had slowed, but its eyes were wide, constantly scanning the shadows of the room. Daniel couldn't blame it. They were both trapped in a war they hadn't signed up for, but there was no going back now. The door to the room slid open again, and Daniel's hand instinctively reached for the weapon at his side. But it was only Zethar, the Torathi cadet who had warned him earlier. "You've made your choice," Zethar said quietly, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "And now the whole academy knows it." Daniel didn't speak, his eyes flicking to the cub, which was still watching the doorway, alert. Zethar's voice softened. "You're not going to win this, Hayes, but there's something else you should know." Daniel raised an eyebrow, waiting. Zethar leaned closer, lowering his voice even more. "There's a faction here. Not all of us support this military training. There's a group of cadets, dissidents, really, who have been working against the high command. They don't want the cub to be used as a weapon either. If you want help, you'll have to trust them, but it'll come at a cost." Daniel's heart raced, but he didn't show it. "What cost?" Zethar hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously to Soren. "There's no going back once you join them. You'll be branded a traitor not just to the military, but to your own people, and there will be no turning back from the consequences." Daniel stood up slowly, his muscles aching from the strain of the day's events. But in that moment, he knew what he had to do. He couldn't run, he couldn't hide, not when there was a chance to fix things, to make things right. "Then let's do it," Daniel said, his voice firm. Zethar nodded. "I'll take you to them tomorrow." The next morning came with a heavy fog that clung to the ground, suffocating the landscape in a muted stillness. Zhursh 9, with its alien terrain, looked as desolate as it felt. The sound of boots on metal floors reverberated through the corridors, a constant reminder that time was running out. Daniel's mind raced as he walked alongside Zethar, the Torathi cadet who had become his reluctant ally. His footsteps were slow but deliberate, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and fear. Soren walked quietly beside him, its large eyes scanning their surroundings with a wariness that mirrored Daniel's own. "You know, once you do this, you won't be able to undo it," Zethar said, his voice low. "You'll be marked as a traitor. Your career will be over before it even begins. Are you sure you want to go through with it?" Daniel glanced at him, his gaze steely. "I don't have a choice. You said yourself it's not just about the cub anymore, it's about what they're doing to us. I won't stand by and let them turn Soren into a weapon, not like this, not again." Zethar didn't respond, but his eyes softened slightly. They walked in silence for a few more moments until they reached the far end of the complex. Here, the walls seemed colder, the air more oppressive. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, clinical corridors they'd walked through before. This was where the dissidents operated, hidden away from the prying eyes of the command. "This is it," Zethar said, pausing in front of a heavy door with a set of complex security locks. "We'll go in through the back, it's the only way." Daniel nodded. He wasn't sure who these dissidents were, but he knew one thing: they were his only chance, his only hope. The Torathi leadership had shown their true face, and if he was going to protect Soren and perhaps save himself, he would have to trust them. Zethar input a series of codes into the terminal beside the door, and the heavy lock clicked open. The door slid back with a quiet hiss, revealing a dimly lit corridor beyond. The air was thick with the scent of stale metal and the faint hum of hidden machinery. Inside, Daniel was greeted by a small group of cadets, their faces tense but determined. They weren't the military elite. These were the ones who had been quietly watching from the shadows, seeing the cracks in the system and waiting for someone to make the first move. One of them, a female cadet with dark purple skin and silver markings along her neck, stepped forward. Her name was Torres, and her eyes were sharp, scanning Daniel and Soren with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. "You're here," Torai said, her voice soft but urgent. "I didn't think you would make it." "I don't have much of a choice," Daniel replied, his voice steady. He gestured to Soren. "This is Soren. He's not just a weapon. He's not some tool for your military. He's a living creature, and he deserves a chance." Torais glanced at the cub, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she nodded, turning to a set of monitors on the far wall. The rest of the dissidents moved silently to their stations, each focused on their task. There was no fanfare, no applause. This wasn't about heroism, it was about survival. "We've been gathering intel on the Torathi leadership," Torais continued, her voice now a whisper. "The command is planning something big. They're going to publicly take the cub, make an example out of it. They want to show the rest of the galaxy that no creature can defy them, not even one of their own." Daniel clenched his fists at the thought. "When?" "Soon," Torai said, her voice dark. "They're mobilizing. They'll be here in a few hours, probably less. You'll have to move fast if you want to get Soren out of here." Daniel nodded. He knew time was running out, but this wasn't just about escaping anymore. This was about striking back, showing that they weren't going to stand by and let the Torathi control everything. "We'll need to get to the transport docks," Zethar said, stepping forward. "There's a shuttle waiting, but it's risky. The entire base will be on high alert once they realize we're missing. You'll need to move fast if you're caught." "We won't be caught," Daniel interrupted. His voice was hard. He wasn't about to let them fail now. Not after everything they'd been through. He turned to Soren, his hand resting lightly on the cub's back. The creature's eyes flicked to him, its body still but alert, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. "We're not running away," Daniel said, his words directed at the cub. "We're fighting for you." The journey to the transport docks was a blur of hurried steps, sharp glances, and tight corners. Daniel kept his hand on Soren's back, guiding the cub through the maze of hallways and stairwells, each step heavier than the last. The dissidents had cleared the path for them, but the tension in the air was suffocating. Every footstep seemed to echo louder than the last, every distant sound a potential threat. Daniel's heart raced with the fear of discovery, but he didn't slow down. As they reached the final hallway leading to the docks, the unmistakable sound of alarms blared through the complex. The base was on lockdown. "They've found us," Torais muttered, her face pale with urgency. "We don't have much time." Daniel's pulse quickened as he glanced over his shoulder, half expecting the military to appear in force. But there was no turning back now. They had to make it to the shuttle, if they did. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, blocking their path. It was a tall, broad-shouldered Torathi officer, his face grim. He was flanked by two cadets, their hands hovering over their weapons. "Cadet Hayes," the officer said, his voice cold. "It seems you've made a mess of things." Daniel took a step forward, his body tensed and ready. "Get out of my way." The officer's lips curled into a slight smile. "You're not going anywhere, Hayes. You're coming with us, all of you." Soren's muscles tensed, a low growl emanating from its throat. Daniel could feel the cub's anger simmering just below the surface. It wanted to fight, but Daniel knew that wasn't the solution. "I'm not coming with you," Daniel said, his voice steady but a sharp edge in it. "And neither is Soren." The officer's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "You're too far gone to stop now. The higher-ups won't let you win." "I'm not trying to win," Daniel replied. "I'm trying to survive."